All right, we are going to look at William Wordsworth's uh, prospectus to the Excursion today. It's the final work that we're going to look at, the final complete work at any rate, that we're going to look at from Wordsworth. I have averred to the significance of several other works in the class that we're not looking at, like Tintern Abbey and the Immortality Ode, which I think are really seminal works in understanding Wordsworth's um, Platonizing or his attempt to present a more philosophic rather than a theological understanding of what an epic is. But it's in the Excursion that I think we see something a little bit more progressive, shall we say. And to some degree, it reflects the age in which the prospectus was written. So it was concluded in 1800, so shortly after the lyrical ballads were published and completed, and obviously before the first version of the Prelude, or at least the lengthy version of the Prelude in 1805, but after the two-part Prelude. So it's in that range of his thinking, and what we can see that it's marked by is considerably less orthodox positions on many things. And in fact, it's clear that in this Wordsworth deviates entirely from a Christian understanding of life, and that becomes clear as if it weren't evident. But when we see how many references the prospectus makes to Milton's Paradise Lost and Milton's own references to his understanding of what he's doing in writing the epic from the angle from which he approaches the epic. If you recall, Milton spoke in Book 9 of his desire to write this epic, but could not find fit subject matter. He didn't want to write about knights and battles and conflict on a physical front, but rather on the spiritual front. And he also thought that true heroism was not constituted in vanquishing one's enemies through martial means, through the strength of one's arm, but rather through fortitude and through faith and through all the things with which Milton concludes Book 12 of Paradise Lost, adding faith and virtue and knowledge and love. These things that were things that Milton regarded as fit epic heroism. And in so doing, of course, he upends the classical model of heroism without at the same time getting rid of the machinery of the epic. And it's one of the interesting things when we come to read Paradise Lost, and I'll look at it next semester when we do a course on Milton, and we'll look at it at some length. Milton is clearly not only alluding to the classical epics, he is heavily leaning on the even the characters and the language and the vast catalog of knowledge that constitutes Paradise Lost. A great deal of it is steeped in classical learning. So Milton is clearly nodding or tipping his cap to the greatness of those whom he is effectively claiming to supersede, not because he thinks that he is superior, although he probably does think he's superior to Homer and to Virgil, but more to his subject matter, which he regards as not just superior in degree, but almost in kind. And that's because Milton's hero is God. And so it's a very different sort of epic in its scope and in its significance to that of the ancient pagan epics. Nonetheless, it is clear when Milton does this that he's not that he is clearly contradistinguishing himself from his predecessors. He's not claiming to be following in their footsteps. And to some degree, it's likewise here with Wordsworth in his prospectus to the Excursion. The numerous references that he makes to Milton are ones on which he is also distinguishing his subject matter from Milton's, and not only his subject matter, but his notion of heroism. And we're going to get to that in a second, and we'll see that his model of heroism fits more or less with what we would in our day probably speak of as progressive humanism, whatever we mean by human at that point. And it's interesting. on that note that that one of you wrote me saying that it was very interesting how oddly the Romantic poets interpreted Milton and his epic Paradise Lost, and how much at odds the way in which they interpreted Milton to intend things would be from what Milton actually intended. So there's a divergence here, and to some degree it's a hermeneutic issue in the Romantic period. And this is the challenge for us in reading these texts. There is, to some degree, what we see in the Romantic period is the beginning of what later comes to be called reader response theory. It's almost a willful misreading of the author's original intention, and a belief thereby that they are making progress upon what the author wrote. Now, to some degree, we could say that Mr. Milton was himself guilty of this crime, of misreading and willfully misinterpreting. And it's hard to rebut the charge insofar as Milton does utterly transform the epic and what constitutes epic heroism. And the only defense we can offer to Milton on this front is simply that it is not Milton who is making or inventing the notion of heroism that he presents in his epic. It's that of Christian theology. And that's because its notion of heroism is the servant king, Jesus Christ, who conquers his enemies precisely by being defeated on the cross of Calvary. Bloodied, beaten, abandoned by his friends, surrounded by his enemies, crucified outside of the city garbage dump in a backwater of the Roman Empire. I mean, there could be hardly a less magnificent spectacle. It's utterly ignominious. And yet, on that day when Christ was crucified, the Bible asserts that God fulfilled his promise made back in Genesis that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. And 3 days later, he rose again, just as he prophesied he would. And so with that in mind, the New Testament thinks and theologizes and writes on the notion of and how different Christian life is from that of the world. And so when Milton presents his version of epic heroism, he simply follows along the lines that has been of the apostles and the Church Catholic, which has been expressed for millennia, quite frankly, by that point. But there's no doubt that to some degree it's a reinterpretation of what constitutes epic heroism. Now, the question is, does Wordsworth do the same, namely to reinterpret what constitutes heroism, or does he willfully misread what heroism is? And there is some gray area there. And I think among the Romantics in general, we can see various degrees of willful misprision, to use Harold Bloom's word, misprision, Prision. And to some degree, it is simply saying the subject matter of our notion of heroism is simply superior to Mr. Milton's. And the reason why it is, and it becomes plain in the prospectus, is precisely because it diverges from Milton's theology. And so what we see here, I think, is we're not just reinterpreting a classical form of heroic literature, namely the epic, and not just reinterpretively do is reinterpret what constitutes a paradise within. Milton connects it with abiding in the presence of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. What we are going to see all of the Romantics will do, and that includes Milton or Wordsworth, and Wordsworth most clearly here, is their notion of what paradise is an earthly paradise in the sense that it is not does not come with the second coming. It comes immediately, and it is effectively the union or the marriage of the mind with the world around us, or with nature, to use Wordsworth's phrase. And with this, I think that Wordsworth becomes a barometer for the modern human sciences, which effectively announce what C.S. Lewis calls the great divorce. the great divorce between heaven and earth that is effectively announced in Scripture. And there's a shift here that takes place in Romantic hermeneutics and Romantic poetics, which I think is in itself fascinating. But there's no doubt how influential and important it is. And what we see is a progressive ideology being worked out, the sort of progressive ideology which is systematized in the work of the German writers like Hegel. But with all that said, let me say a few words about the poem, just a few prefatory remarks here. First of all, as I say, it was written in 1800 or published in 1800, completed, and it was originally intended to be the conclusion of the first book of The Recluse. But The Recluse was not written at that point, and it was only published with the Excursion in 1814 as a kind of prospectus of the design and scope of The Recluse as a whole. And The Recluse had not been written and never actually did come about. And so it was intended to be the Excursion was meant to be the second of three parts, and not much of The Recluse ever came to light in the end. And what's ironic about that is all of this was meant as a way for Wordsworth to prepare his mind to write the grand epic that he believed that he'd been chosen, called, whatever language you want to use, gifted to write. And so this was a way of preparing him for it, in the same way perhaps that we could understand Milton himself using his early poetry to work through various forms and prepare his mind for the grand labor of writing an actual epic. So there's no doubt in Wordsworth's mind that this is a great endeavor, and he needs to be at the top of his game. And so he is preparing himself for that task, and unfortunately he never does come to write that grand epic. And most critics, myself included, regard the Prelude as that epic. And we have nothing else to disprove that. But it's I'll skip over what the Excursion actually is, because I'm not really interested in the Excursion per se. It's the prospectus which is interesting, because in the prospectus, Wordsworth alludes to Milton's several invocations of the Muse in Paradise Lost. And if you're interested, just to refresh your memories, you can see them at the beginning of Book 1 of Paradise Lost, of Book 3 of Paradise Lost, of Book 7 of Paradise Lost, and of Book 9. Now, of the four invocations that Milton uses, it's actually the latter two that I think we, in particular, can see alluded to in Wordsworth's prospectus. And I'll say more about that in a minute. But he doesn't talk about, there's no references to light here, which Milton invokes in Book 3 of Paradise Lost. There's a little bit, perhaps, of Book 1 here in the invocation. But what I'm going to do here is go through it. It's short enough for me to read it, and I'll do that, and then I'll seek to comment on, simply make some comments and references to Milton's epics, and we can see wherein Wordsworth is making his mark and saying, here's where I see my epic subject matter to be, and where it relates explicitly to Milton. And it is almost explicitly. Whereas when Milton writes his epics, he has no immediate individual that he's marking out. It's a whole epic tradition. Whereas with Milton, Milton seems to dominate Wordsworth's mind here. He's not even thinking about the Aeneid or Homer's works. It's Milton that he's fixated upon, and therefore it's Milton's theology in particular, which is front and center for him. So let me begin by reading the prospectus, and then I'll comment. On man, on nature, and on human life, musing in solitude, I oft perceive fair trains of imagery before me rise, accompanied by feelings of delight pure, or with no unpleasing sadness mixed. And I am conscious of affecting thoughts and dear remembrances, whose presence soothes or elevates the mind, intent to weigh the good and evil of our mortal state. To these emotions, whencesoe'er they come, whether from breath of outward circumstance, or from the soul, an impulse to herself, I would give utterance in numerous verse, of truth, of grandeur, beauty, love, and hope, and melancholy fear subdued by faith, of blessed consolations in distress, of moral strength and intellectual power, of joy in widest commonality spread, of the individual mind that keeps her own inviolate retirement, subject there to conscience only, and the law supreme of that intelligence which governs all, I sing. Fit audience let me find, though few. So prayed, more gaining than he asked, the bard, in holiest mood. Urania, I shall need thy guidance, or a greater muse if such descend to earth or dwell in highest heaven. For I must tread on shadowy ground, must sink deep, and aloft descending breathe in worlds to which the heaven of heavens is but a veil. All strength, all terror, single or in bands, that ever was put forth in personal form, Jehovah, with his thunder and the choir of shouting angels and the imperial thrones, I pass them unalarmed. Not chaos, not the darkest pit of lowest Erebus, nor aught of blinder vacancy, scooped out by help of dreams, can breed such fear and awe as fall upon us often when we look into our minds, into the mind of man, my haunt and the main region of my song. Beauty, a living presence of the earth, surpassing the most fair ideal forms which craft of delicate spirits hath composed from earth's materials, waits upon my steps, pitches her tents before me as I move, an hourly neighbor. Paradise and groves Elysian, fortunate fields like those of old sought in the Atlantic main. Why should they be a history only of departed things, or a mere fiction of what never was? For the discerning intellect of man, when wedded to this goodly universe, in love and holy passion, shall find these a simple produce of the common day. I, long before the blissful hour arrives, would chant in lowliest peace, in lonely peace, the spousal verse of this great consummation. And by words which speak of nothing more than what we are, would I arouse the sensual from their sleep of death, and win the vacant and the vain to noble raptures, while my voice proclaims how exquisitely the individual mind and the progressive powers, perhaps no less of the whole species, to the external world is fitted. And how exquisitely, too, theme this but little heard of among men, the external world is fitted to the mind. And the creation, by no lower name can it be called, which they with blended might accomplish. This is our high argument. Such grateful haunts foregoing, if I oft must turn elsewhere, to travel near the tribes and fellowships of men, and see ill sights of madding passions, mutually inflamed, must hear humanity in fields and groves pipe solitary anguish, or must hang brooding above the fierce confederate storm of sorrow, barricadoed evermore within the walls of cities. May these sounds have their authentic comment, that even these hearing, I be not downcast or forlorn. Descend, prophetic spirit, that inspires the human soul of universal earth, dreaming on things to come, and dost possess a metropolitan temple in the hearts of mighty poets. Upon me bestow a gift of genuine insight, that my song with star-like virtue in its place may shine, shedding benignant influence and secure itself from all malevolent effect of those mutations that extend their sway through the nether sphere. And if with this I mix more lowly matter, with the thing contemplated, describe the mind and man contemplating, and who and what he was, the transitory being that beheld this vision, when and where and how he lived. Be not this labor useless. If such theme may sort with highest objects, then, dread power, those whose gracious favor is the primal source of all illumination, may my life express the image of a better time, more wise desires, and simpler manners. Nurse my heart in genuine freedom, all pure thoughts be with me. So shall thy unfailing love guide and support and cheer me to the end. Now, this whole prospectus, all 100 and I believe 6 lines of it, contains echoes of, as I said, the Miltonic epic, Paradise Lost, and also some phrases that would be common to those who know the Book of Common Prayer. And so what's interesting about the entire clothing here of Wordsworth's Prospectus is how Christian it is in its allusions here. It's inconceivable that Wordsworth could write this epic without having read Milton's epic. He could not write this invocation and regard as epic subject matter what he asserts to be epic subject matter without Milton's inversion of the classical epic and with his notion of heroism as a paradise within. Wordsworth agrees with Milton, by the way, that paradise lies within us. Wherein he differs is that that paradise is not in the presence of God, but rather in the presence of nature and of this visible world, which no one in the classical world would agree with, and Milton also would clearly regard as an absurd statement, since the world is fallen and marked by corruption. But we see here in Wordsworth what becomes characteristic of the Romantics in general, which is, I think, a downplaying of the significance of radical evil. And I can't really emphasize that enough. The Romantic notion of evil is effectively, it's certainly not orthodox, to put it mildly. Evil is something that does arise, but it is something that is not lodged in the human breast and a part of a fallen world. It's something that can be overcome, and it can be overcome by human effort, for that matter. So, as I say, the nature of evil is not radical. There is no such thing as original sin. There is no such thing as radical evil, other than, and here's where we find the contemporary resonances with this, other than in holding to views that disagree with the Romantics' effectively theological statement on human nature. And we've seen enough now of Wordsworth to see that his account of the fall comes to every person, but one is not born with sin. You're not conceived in sin. We don't have a sin nature. It's possible theoretically to avoid the fall. And in fact, young children have effectively avoided the fall in Wordsworth's rendering of the fall, because what constitutes the fall is simply growing old and imitating the ways of the world. And the world, when Wordsworth speaks of the world and imitating its ways, he's talking about the manners of civilization, and manners and morals and decorum and the artifice and the whole culture that arises in humanity over the centuries. To some degree, Wordsworth wants to wipe the slate clean and start over. And in that sense, he falls very much in the Cartesian tradition of starting from nothing, doubting everything, and in this case, doubting the validity or the importance of Christian tradition, and simply going to proceed on the basis of a certitude, and here the certitude is of the goodness of his intentions and the nobility of his feelings, and in the purity of his passions. This is the thing that he trusts in, and he trusts in it because he places such weight on the imagination as a faculty to overcome the fall, which he says effectively everybody experiences simply by imitating the ways of the world. So Wordsworth, like the Apostle Paul, calls upon his readers to imitate him, not in his conduct, but more in his own word is his mood, or in his way of thinking about the world, and to have blessed thoughts as a way of redeeming the world. So it's an intellectual process. And so in Wordsworth's sense, this is the paradise within. It's a way of thinking. And in that sense, it's a far more noetic, far more intellectual form of theology than we would find in classic Christian theology, because of course in Christian theology, it's not sufficient to possess the right doctrine. We also have to live in the right way, because Christian theology, I mean, the God of Christian theology took on a body, and he lived in a certain way, and the body matters in Christian theology. But if you look at Wordsworth's notion of the paradise within, it really is within, and it's almost a disembodied sense, almost a form of Gnosticism. And later writers like de Lubac here, and I think I see him over my shoulder here, The Drama of Atheistic Humanism, speaks of the characteristic Gnosticism that marks 19th century literature and onwards, and to my mind marks the thinking of our day as well, including its view of the body and our relation to the body. So the paradise within us is not connected to the bodies in which those minds are connected. And in fact, the relation of mind-body is not entirely clear at all in the thinking of our contemporaries. And I talk about this a great deal. Modern psychology began with something closer to a mind or a soul, and nowadays it's moving very strongly in the direction of a materialistic notion of the mind, such that the mind is effectively the brain. And so what we call thinking is just epiphenomenology. It's the feeling, the chemical impulse that gives rise to the feeling that we are thinking, but we're not actually thinking. We can't know that we have thoughts. But I'm digressing a bit here. The outset of the prospectus here, the first lines, he announces his subject matter, and note that he concludes the first part of this, and I think we can see it conclude in line 23 here, with I sing. This word I sing here, which has been repeated by poets since Homer, certainly, is that which is inspired by a higher power than his own. Well, what higher power would that be? For the classical poets, it's calling upon one of the 9 muses. Calliope would be the goddess of epic poetry. And what's interesting about that, and I've mentioned this in other classes, is that Calliope's mother is that of memory. And so when one is calling upon inspiration, the inspiration doesn't come ex nihilo, it comes in remembering events that have taken place in the past. But this is very much at odds with Wordsworth's notion of what would constitute inspiration anyway, because he doesn't want to remember what has happened in the past per se, because he doesn't want the past to guide his notion of a progressive humanity. He wants to begin, as I say, from ground zero with a tabula rasa and proceed on forward with that. And so when he calls upon the muse, then he doesn't call upon the muse of epic poetry. He calls upon Urania. Now, Urania is, again, one of the 9 muses in the classical world, but it's the goddess of astronomy. Now, you might wonder why Wordsworth is invoking astronomy here, because it's a very seemingly odd thing to invoke. Other than that, I think what Wordsworth means by Urania is the cosmic, the almost the supernatural, but and yet within the cosmos. By the way, Milton himself invokes Urania in Book 7 of Paradise Lost, but it's when he comes to speak of cosmology in Book 7. We'll see next semester, Milton discusses various views of cosmology that were being discussed in his day, largely because of the influence of Galileo. Whether the cosmology was Ptolemaic, as it had been thought for over a millennium, or whether it was the Copernican model that Galileo seemed to give credence to, and Milton himself visited Galileo. Milton speculates on that in Book 7 of Paradise Lost, and so he invokes Urania at that point. Why does Wordsworth do so? Because he's not talking about cosmology. It seems, and he's also not talking about epic poetry here per se. He's talking about a universality, and that's what is specifically romantic to my mind, and wherein Wordsworth believes that he has superseded his great role model, Mr. Milton. It's not sufficient that he subverts the classical model of epic heroism, of suffering for truth's sake, rather than defeating one's enemies in battle. That's not sufficient, because that's too worldly still. Wordsworth's understanding of epic heroism is more universal. It is going to be literally without bounds. Now, universal I need to talk about universality here, because universal in the traditional sense is connected to the cosmos and with astronomy and with the heavens above us. That's not what Wordsworth means, I think, by invoking Urania here. I think Wordsworth is thinking of universal in the sense that the Enlightenment uses that sense, in the sense that it is without any prejudices, without any earthly characteristics. It is so in Immanuel Kant's little treatise, What is Enlightenment? He talks about the escape from the self-imposed tutelage to the past. And he says the people who are marked by the Enlightenment as he is will say, dare to know. And daring to know means refusing to listen to the counsel of the past. And that includes the counsel of those who've reflected on earthly matters, and including their cosmology. Wordsworth is moving beyond all that. Now, there's something intensely idealistic about Wordsworth's understanding of universality, but I think it is characteristic of the age. And I wrote upon this subject matter, if you're interested, in my book, Romanticism, Hermeneutics, and the Crisis of the Human Sciences. I talk about this different notion of universality, which is very, very different from that of the cosmology of old, because it's not referring to astronomy, it's referring to a boundless, universal thinking that can be applied in any situation, in any context, and will always be true. And it's not contextualized. It is always true. It's universally true. It's the categorical imperative that Immanuel Kant talks about. And with that sense, there can be no progress beyond Wordsworth's notion of progress, because it is truly universal. It has no limitations to it. And so we see when he starts speaking about his subject matter and about his mind, we can see that is rather vague, other than what it says it is not. It's not Milton's theology. It's not Millfield in the second coming of Christ, where we will see him face to face and where he will renew creation. For Wordsworth, that second coming is anticipated by the mind itself and the mind wedded to nature. So I'll go to the text itself here. So the first line here says, on man, on nature, and on human life, musing in solitude. Now note that as the context in which he presents his epic as well. He is musing in solitude. We've already seen that Wordsworth's heroes are prototypically, characteristically, individuals, and individuals in the sense that they are autonomous. They recognize no bounds around them. They're almost without bodies. They don't interact with other people. There's no dialogue in Wordsworth's. We just read Wordsworth's Prelude. There's no dialogue in it. There's no interaction. There's no dramatic exchanges. It's all Wordsworth talking about himself, his past sense of self. So if there is a dramatized self, it's only Wordsworth, the present man, speaking about the past man. But it's all Wordsworth. It's an internal epic. The paradise within is simply Wordsworth. Wordsworth is that great paradise, and how strongly he feels about his experiences in the natural world. And we note also, we saw in the prelude, that the moments when Wordsworth particularly fell astray and went astray from his epic vision is when he went to France and got involved in politics and the affairs of men and the affairs of civilization per se. And he strayed from his calling at that point and become very much influenced by the passions of the day, which he thought eventually led to the terrors of the French Revolution, Robespierre and the guillotine, and eventually the coming to power of Napoleon Bonaparte, who brought martial force to Europe and brought the very antithesis of what Milton, or rather what Wordsworth, would have regarded as the aim of the French Revolution to begin with, which was simply to subvert tyranny and to usher in a better world. Well, Wordsworth still thinks that that better world is possible, but now it will not be through politics. It will be through almost a monastic, solitary, blessed thought process, which he himself will experience, but also will convey to others that they might experience it likewise. So it's a very, monastic's not a bad way of putting it. Monastic sense of epic heroism, which really is at odds with Milton's. Milton's Paradise Within was asserted to Adam and Eve, and they were then to go out and to be fruitful and multiply and to speak of this, but it was a corporate paradise within, whereas Wordsworth's is very much of an individualistic one, without reference or without any need of another person, let alone a female person as a male poet. And we will find, interestingly, there is a female presence in the prospectus, and it's nature. The mind is effectively masculine, and nature is effectively feminine. Mother Nature, or in this case, wife nature. And he says, when he is musing in solitude, he oft perceives fair trains of imagery before him rise, accompanied by feelings of delight, pure or with no unpleasing sadness mix. And he's conscious of affecting thoughts, feeling thoughts. When Wordsworth refers to thinking, and when he also refers to feeling, we can see in both cases, thinking and feeling are very tightly linked in Wordsworth's thinking. And in each of these cases, he says that the soul is an impulse to herself. Line 12 here. The soul is now not in relation to God. The idea of a soul is it's not in reference to the gods either. It's its own motivation, its own cause, as it were. So this is divorced of any traditionally understood theological thinking. It is literally a self-invented sense of self. And it's not even clear what he means by soul at this point, or mind, because he refers to the mind in line 8 and the soul in line 12, and he uses them in exchanges the two, and they effectively mean the same thing. Well, this is a far cry from a Christian understanding of what a soul is, because a soul is effectively the entirety of a person, the essence of a person. And personhood entails an embodied personhood. And that's going to become significant when we come to his rejection of God explicitly, more or less in line 32, where he refers to any sense of heaven of heavens in personal form. He rejects personhood. Now, personhood is important here to note, because personhood is the category, or the what we will describe God as in his own nature, the tripersonal, the Trinitarian God. There's one God in three persons. Personhood is essential to the understanding of Godhead, but also of human nature thereby. And so Milton, when he presents his epic Paradise Lost and talks about epic subject matter, he clearly has a notion of what the divine person is like. and thereby what the human person is like. But Wordsworth, having dispensed with the divine person, also has to dispense, to my mind, with the notion of the human person. And what he's left with is the mind or the soul, which is effectively disembodied, to go back to what I said earlier here. And I'm going to submit to you, once he does that and abandons the body and external action, and we get a sort of an internal landscape here, a paradise within, it loses it loses all drama, first of all. But also it becomes very difficult to understand the particular significance of other people, their integrity as individuals, their difference between who we are. And so we get effectively sort of a monism where everyone is assumed to be exactly the same, without sex, without age. It's just this self. I refer to it in another context as a selfish genius. It's the self, and the spirit, the spirit that gives rise to this sense of selfhood here. But in any case, going back to the text here, he says that of the soul, which is an impulse to itself, herself rather, I would give utterance in numerous verse of truth, of grandeur, beauty, love, and hope. What do these terms mean? He's presenting it in the backdrop of Christian theology. He's saying mine is not that. What does truth and grandeur and beauty and love and hope mean divorced of a Christian context? Is it possible to divorce Milton's theology and retain the inherited meaning of all of these terms? And to my mind, it's not. And we are living with the consequence of that in our own day, where now truth is effectively subjective. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Love is whatever particular feeling I'm animated by at this particular moment. And hope is something that only fools have. But he likewise speaks of melancholy fear subdued by faith, etc., etc. And at the end here, the individual mind that keeps her own inviolate retirement, subject there to conscience only. Now, conscience is a moral awareness of an accountability to an external objective standing. Does that not invoke what we would speak of as natural law, at the very least, if not Christian faith? I think it does. So he's leaning on the very things that he effectively is also casting away. The very term conscience, it's not that you can't have a conscience and be something other than a Christian. You can have a conscience, of course, but conscience and a sense of of truth to what then? He doesn't announce what these things are. And I think we're only we're forced to guess what he's speaking about here, because he then goes on to speak of the law supreme of that intelligence which governs all. Well, now it sounds more like a god, but he speaks of it as an intelligence, which is again hardly a orthodox way of understanding it. It's almost sounds like almost a materialist understanding of things. But of all these, he says, I sing fit audience, let me find though few. He's obviously taken this from the book 7 of Paradise Lost, as I said. So lines 1 to 15 in book 7 of Paradise Lost, Milton is now explicitly referencing here. And so he goes on and he says, so prayed. Now, who's he praying to when he prays? It's not clear to me, and it's very odd that he even refers to this act of invocation here as a prayer. He's not calling upon a power outside of himself to inspire him. He's actually praying, asking for something that he does not have the capacity to possess. So there is an element of submission in this, and of a recognition of something greater than himself in this. And he says that he gains more than he asked, which is an interesting experience. Milton experiences no such thing. When he calls upon, even at the outset, he announces his poetic subject matter, even announces that he has had his verses dictated to him nightly by the muse. So he informs us of that, but he's uncertain of whether he will be successful in his endeavors because of the audience, the time, etc. If you think Milton was self-confident, look at Wordsworth. He gains even more than he asked on this. I'm not quite sure how he knows that he gained that. If it's true that he gained that, will that not be reflected in the power and influence of this prospectus and what follows? And I think based on the popularity and influence of the Excursion, we would say that in fact he gained a lot less than he asked. But nonetheless, and it's the bard that does this at any rate. And in his holiest mood, now note that he has to mood, holiness is now a mood. It's not a conformity to God's moral character, like the holiness code of Scripture. It's not connected to a binary notion of good and evil. It's a mood of sorts, a sense of spiritual feelings, very vague in that sense. But now he calls upon Urania, and he said, Urania, I shall need thy guidance or a greater muse, if such descend to earth or dwell in highest heaven. Again, the counters of earth and heaven are traditional ones, but to some degree, Wordsworth is going to ridicule the notion of a heaven. He's going to anticipate John Lennon. You can imagine there's no heaven. It's easy for him. Here's where we go. He says, for I must tread on shadowy ground, must sink deep, and aloft, ascending, breathe in worlds to which the heaven of heavens is but a veil. And this is what I meant by the universal nature of Milton's epic claim. He is going to go beyond even the notion, the venue of the gods, whether it's on Mount Olympus, where the Olympian gods of Homer are said to reside, or of Milton's heaven, where God, the creator of heaven and earth, is said to reside outside space and time, as Milton depicts him. He is going even beyond that. Now, I don't know how you go beyond God who resides outside space and time, as Milton depicts God to reside in Book 3 of Paradise Lost. But Wordsworth claims that he is going beyond that. And that heaven of heavens is but a veil for something that goes beyond that. Now, I have no idea what that actually means, and neither does he. But it's hyperbole. He's simply saying my notion of godly intellectual substance is superior to Mr. Milton's, I think. And that becomes clear in lines 31 and 32. All strength, all terror, single or in bands, that ever was put forth in personal form, Jehovah, with his thunder and the choir of shouting angels and the imperial thrones, I pass them unalarmed. Not chaos, not the darkest pit of Lois Erebus, nor aught of blind. So he gets rid of heaven, and then he gets rid of hell, Milton's hell. Neither of them, nor aught of blinder vacancy, scooped out by help of dreams, can breathe such fear and awe as fall upon us often when we look into our minds, into the mind of man, my haunt and the main region of my song. Okay, so he announces his poetic subject matter and also what constitutes the subject of reverence here, and it's simply our minds. Now, this is again an incomprehensible claim without leaning on what we saw earlier in Edmund Burke's writing and the sense of sublimity. And to some degree, the Kantian turn on this, which is that what we really are in awe of is not the sublime natural object, but rather our mind's apprehension of something that is greater than the greatest possible thoughts. It's not that thing which is God, it's our ability to conceive it. And therefore, it's us that is the God. That's what Wordsworth is asserting here. And our mind. And with all of that grandeur, and with all of that capacity for experiencing sublime terror, which he is cataloged in the prelude. Nonetheless, he does not speak of himself in tyrannical terms. He says that that mind which can experience the awe in the presence of nature is nonetheless satisfied with it in its present form. And therefore it's a spousal verse. He'll go on to say this. So he says, it's my haunt, the main region of my song, beauty. So I just spoke of sublimity. Here we have beauty, the two counters of the Burkean aesthetic treatise, the sublime and the beautiful. Beauty, a living presence of the earth, surpassing the most fair ideal forms which craft of delicate spirits hath composed from earth's materials, waits upon my steps. Pitches are tense before me as I move, an hourly neighbor. Paradise and groves Elysian, fortunate fields, like those of old sought in the Atlantic main, why should they be a history only of departed things, or a mere fiction of what never was? So what Wordsworth is, again, this is what marks it as a progressive epic. He is not going to lay hold of something that happened in the past. And we will see that every heroic tale up to this point ever told is about what happened in the past. There's a great man, there's a great woman, there's a great hero, there's a great God. Irrespective of who the subject matter of heroism is, it is a tale of what happened in the past, which is of such profound influence that I'm going to keep telling the tale and telling of what happened in the past. The Bible talks about what Jesus did, and those who are possessed of biblical faith did throughout Scripture, and God working through them. But likewise, Homer's epic, the Aeneid, etc., and on through notions of heroism. We can look at Beowulf, the actions of a hero. These are being recounted. Wordsworth has no interest in recounting the heroism of anyone else. He wants to talk about the heroism of you and me. And what is heroic is our way of thinking about the world. It's not any action. It's, he says, for the discerning intellect of man, when wedded to this goodly universe in love and holy passion, shall find these a simple produce of the common day. So this is what's progressive. It can be, and to some degree is imminent. We don't need to wait for it in time to come. We don't need to hearken to the great heroism of the past. We can simply dwell in that paradise right now by having the right mood and the right attitude towards the world around us. That's Milton's, Wordsworth's epic subject matter here. And he is quite plain that when he speaks of this, he is doing something that is effectively intrinsic to the progressive powers of humanity. And he'll refer to that explicitly. I think it's in line 63 here, because he says, and the progressive powers perhaps no less of the whole species, to the whole, the external world is fitted, and how exquisitely too. That's his theme, how the mind is exquisitely fitted to the external world. And theme this but little heard of mine, how the external world is fitted to the mind. So they are hand in glove. They are yin and yang. They literally fit together, the mind and the world. So we don't need to solve the question of wherein we regard the greater power to be. Is it set in a metaphysical realm? No, it is a wholly immanent realm in which the metaphysical realm is effectively the mind and the physical realm is effectively nature. And at the same time, it's hard to say where one begins and where the other is, because if you recall last time we talked about how it's half created and half perceived. It's unclear where it begins and where it ends. But all of these things constitute what Wordsworth now will call creation. Now, creation is, of course, a weighty theological term. He's leaning on not just Milton here, but the biblical account of the creation of the whole cosmos from out of nothing, ex nihilo, by God. In English, we use the word creation for what an artist does as well as what God does. In the German language, they have separate terms for what God does and what human beings do. So what God does is he schöpfen, and he's the Schöpfer, whereas a poet is a Dichter. A poet, whereas in English, they are together in this one word, creation. And yet it has this theological resonance, which Wordsworth is not wanting to distance himself from. In fact, he wants to explicitly claim it, because he says, by no lower name can it be called, what he wants to speak of here, which they with blended might, the mind and the external world, accomplish. This is our high argument. So he is effectively, and this is the final thing I want to say, he is effectively announcing a new heaven and a new earth in the terms of a marriage, which we see again at the end of the book of Revelation. When God creates a new heaven and a new earth, he brings down a heavenly Jerusalem like a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And God embraces her as her own. So this is the church, the heavenly Jerusalem. Christ the bridegroom, this the bride. In Wordsworth's understanding, leaning on similar sorts of theological resonances and even scriptural resonances, it's now the mind and nature. So I don't think it can be understood even without reference to a biblical framework, and yet it is clearly departing from it in a very secular way. This age, this time, and this time there is no other time. There is no past time, and all future time will be the same as this present time, because there is no superior epic subject matter to this, because this one is universal. There, you cannot supersede what Wordsworth is singing about here. And so he calls upon the prophetic spirit to descend, that inspires the human soul of universal earth, line 84, dreaming on things to come, and dost possess a metropolitan temple in the hearts of mighty poets, and give him this genuine insight. So I think I've given you enough here at any rate to give you a flavor of why I wanted to look at the prospectus to the Excursion, and because it in some ways marks a far clearer and explicit outworking of what Wordsworth conceives as epic subject matter, and does so explicitly against the epic vision of Mr. Milton. So we'll leave it at that, and we will then move on to Mr. Coleridge, and I'll see you next time with that.